Hello friends, I am Arpit and I am here with today's analysis. Today is 5th of February and we are going to deal with two very important topics which are in news. The government debt. The government debt is basically all the liabilities of the central government as well as the state governments, which the government has taken as loans or any other liability like its liabilities in the national savings certificate schemes or mutual funds, anything which it has to pay. Now, this has increased to around 80% of Indian governments, the center as well as the states, according to the IMF report. Earlier, it was less. What has led to the increase? Obviously, the COVID pandemic has led to increase where the government had to borrow more to do its spendings on the welfare for the poor as well as meeting its healthcare needs. On the other hand, the government's income was at an all-time low during COVID due to COVID-induced lockdowns. Is India alone impacted due to high or rising government debts? No. Government debts of developed countries like USA, UK or France have crossed 100% of their GDP. Means they are having more debts than their GDP. So India comparatively is in a better position, but yes, a lot needs to be done to reduce this debt. Next is Uttarakhand's Uniform Civil Code. Uniform Civil Code is a uniform law for replacing all the personal laws related to marriage, divorce, inheritance of property or adoption. Generally, these personal rules are governed by personal laws of different religions. But with a uniform civil code in place, all these personal laws will be replaced by this uniform civil code, and Uttarakhand, if it gets passed, will be the second state in India after Goa to have its uniform civil code. The center, on the other hand, is also aspiring to bring a pan-India uniform civil code since long, but it is unable to bring it right now. It is mentioned in Article 44 of the Constitution as a directive principles of state policy as well. So, let's get started and see what is this government debt first of all. Now, there is a report by IMF which states that the government debt of India is in excess of 80%. It is somewhere around 82% to be exact of the GDP. 82% of the GDP. So let's suppose 100 rupees is the GDP. So we've taken already 82 rupees as loans. All the state governments and the central governments combined. That is basically debt to GDP ratio of the government. That is called as government debt. Now, the combined domestic and external liabilities of both center and the states touched 84.4% of GDP in 2003-4. This was also, the last year of the NDA government at that time. And it fell to 66.4% in 2010-11 during the Congress-led UPA regime. It rose gradually to 67.7% in 2013-14 and 70.4% in 2018-19. So last figure we can say is from 2018-19, 70.4% it was. It has now become 82% presently, according to IMF. So in the last 4 years or so, we have seen increasing government debt. The present government's debt, we see the Modi government's second innings saw the debt GDP ratio soar to 75% in 2019-20 and peak at 88.5% in 2021. 2021, the COVID year, where the government debt was 88.5%, easing to 83.8% in 2021-22 and 81% in the following two fiscal years. The IMF has projected the ratio at 82% in the current fiscal and 82.4% for 2024-25, means next year it is expected to increase by 0.4 percentage points. And if we see this graph over here, 2002-3, the debt was here 82.9%. It fell down to 66.4% in 2010-11 and gradually it started rising. From this 18-19 to 2021, it shot up exponentially from 70 to 88.5%. This was the COVID year where the government had to borrow more funds. Actually, a lot of funds did come from Japan as well to fund various programs like the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana, or to ensure the welfare of the medical workers, frontline medical workers. And India was not alone whose countries or whose expenditure increased. It impacted the entire world. India had to go for taking loans because, on the other hand, income was drastically impacted of the country. There were lockdowns, so there was no or very minimal collection of taxes also, indirect taxes particularly. Center's interest and capital spending. Interest payments is done by the center, which is 3.6% of the GDP. Earlier it was 4.7% of the GDP in 2002-3. So this, if we take a debt, to interest payment, so we'll have to do. That is also substantial in itself, 3.6%. So capital expenditure done by the government is 3.4% of the GDP. So capital expenditure we are doing less. Capital expenditure is that expenditure which will pay us in the future as compared to the interest we are paying. Interest we are paying is more, 3.6% of the GDP presently, which is obviously not a healthy sign. This should at least be more, or interest payment should be less than the capital expenditure. What are the components of public debt? Actually, all the liabilities, domestic, international loans, that will be included for the center and states, plus other liabilities including against small saving schemes, provident funds, special securities issued to the Food Corporation of India, fertilizer firms and oil marketing companies in the form of subsidies, on which they have to pay interest and principal amounts borrowed. So all these kind of expenditures of the government or liabilities of the government will be counted in public debt. Is there any limit of government debt? Actually, there is a law that is called as Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act. It was passed in the year 2003. According to this law, fiscal deficit of the government had to be brought down to 3% or below by 2021-22, which obviously it was not brought down because of the COVID impact. In fact, during that period, the fiscal deficit was very high. 2021 it was somewhere around 9%. 21-22 it was somewhere around 7-8%. We will see a bit. And in that particular law, FRBM law, it has been mentioned about the government debt also. Government debt should be brought down to 60% of the GDP by 2024-25. And it is projected by IMF that in this particular year, the government debt will be 82.4% of the GDP. Where it had to be? It had to be 60%. Now, center's own total outstanding liabilities. If I talk about only the center, see, public debt is liabilities of center and states both combined. But if I talk about only the center as of now, the outstanding liabilities were not to exceed 40% according to this FRBM. But now it is 56.9% in 2023-24, and it is budgeted that it will be 56% in 2024-25. That's well above the original 40% target. So the center's outstanding liability should be 40%. Overall, it should be 60%. But they are surpassing both. Now, why has the debt increased? Now, the most obvious reason behind it is COVID. And when COVID came, a lot of disruptions happened. COVID-induced lockdowns were there, the businesses were impacted, the revenue or the income of the government was impacted because less taxes were being, taken by the government. And expenditures increased of the government. So, basically, income falling, expenditures rising to meet the demands of, I would say, the poor people, or expenditures rising to meet the demands of the frontline health workers or so. That led to increased borrowing by the government. And that borrowing had to be taken from some additional external sources like Japan and all, and some internal sources also. So COVID-induced disruptions that forced governments to borrow more to fund additional public health and social safety net expenditure requirements amid a drying up of revenues. Now, we will see a combined fiscal deficit of center and states combined. It widened from 2018-19 till 2021-22. 5.8, 7.2, 13.1, 10.4. 13.1 was during the first year of COVID. This is the combined fiscal deficit of both center and states. If I talk about fiscal deficit of only the center, it also increased 3.4% here. We were on the path of the fiscal responsibility and budgetary management. Ki by 3% se below we have to take it. By 2021-22 and 2018-19 we were already there 3.4%. But it increased in 2019-20, 4.6%, 9.2% in 2020-21 and 6.8% 2021-22. 2022-23 it was somewhere around 6.1%, and this year we saw in the budget video that it is around 5.8%. For the next year it is projected 5.1%. So we are on this glide path where we are reducing the fiscal deficit, but it is not according to the targets set by the Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act. Now the question is, was India alone impacted? No, India was not an exception. Many countries in the world, they were impacted. If I talk about the most developed countries of the world, USA, the government debt climbed from 108.7% of GDP in 2019. It was already very high for USA. 108.7% of the GDP was there pre-COVID. It climbed to 133.5% in 2020 and 121.4% in 2022 for the US. From 97.4% to 115.1% and 111.7% for France. This is basically 2020 and this is 2022. 85.5% in 2020, 205.6% in 2022. 105.6% in 2020, 105.6% in 2020, 101.4% in 2022, 85.5% in 2019. 60.4, this is for UK. So we can see the debt to GDP ratio for US, UK and France to be surpassing 100% mark. When I talk about China, 60.4% in 2019, it rose to 70.1% in 2020 and 77.1% in 2022. China is an exception where we can see that the maximum debt to GDP ratio for countries was here in 2020. And China's maximum debt to GDP ratio is here in 2022 because China's economy was severely impacted and it's still struggling. Now, these countries raised their expenditures. They gave cash transfers to the people directly in their accounts with the hope that they will be increasing the spending and their economy will be back on track with increased spending. Although inflation will be there, that was anticipated because with increased spending, inflation happens. But in 2022, due to the Russia-Ukraine war, inflation spiraled up. And inflation in these countries was going on this trajectory. It was already very high due to increased spending. In 2022, when the war happened, it exponentially rose. And then these countries were severely impacted. What was the case with India? India did not go for providing free cash transfers. Apart from Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana, in which we provided food grains to the people, and PM Kisan was one such other yojana where only the eligible farmers were being given 6,000 rupees. Apart from it, India did not go for providing free cash transfers. India instead adopted a different approach, like for example the street vendors. One of the most impacted communities due to COVID, India said ki bhai, you take a loan, you return the loan, you take more loan, you return that loan, you take more loan. PM Swanidhi was that yojana. We are not going to give you anything for free. You need to stand up, you need to work hard, and you need to repay the loans. If you repay the loans, then only the next tranche will be given to you. Like the first tranche was 10,000 rupees loan. If that was repaid, then 20,000 rupees loan was the next tranche. Then if that was repaid, it was 50,000 rupees loan in the third tranche. Now, the Modi government, apart from spending more on income and consumption support schemes, also stepped up public investments in roads, railways and other infrastructure. We focused more on capex, which is now delivering or will deliver in the times to come. Our expenditure also increased. Our debt also increased. But our debt was channelized towards capex, not for providing free, I would say, or freebies to the people. That is how we cruised through the COVID situation, and probably that was the reason that why our economy was growing rapidly, not impacted due to the war situation or the COVID situation like these economies were. Impact was there, but impact was not as severe as these economies have been impacted. Now, what does India need to do? So, basically, India can focus on two things, I would say. First is reducing the fiscal deficit, means reducing the expenditure or increasing the income of the government. Fiscal deficit reduces, government debt reduces automatically. And on the other hand, focus on increasing the growth rate of its economy. Now, basically, this is the formula, government debt upon GDP. Now, if fiscal deficit reduces, government debt reduces. This is simple. Numerator is reducing, the government debt to GDP ratio will automatically come down if the numerator is reducing. Or we can also go for the denominator effect. We can focus on increasing the GDP so much that this becomes too big as compared to this. Then also we will see this ratio falling. Ratio falls in two cases, when the numerator reduces or the denominator increases. So this is what two steps we can focus upon right now. Now in 2010-11, when we see the minimum government debt to GDP ratio, at that time GDP growth was very high, around 7.4, 7.5%. That actually did the trick for the country, and we were seeing reduced, I would say, government debt to GDP ratio. So this is what can be done. The next is Uttarakhand's Uniform Civil Code. Now, this assembly is likely to pass this state's Uniform Civil Code, and there's a 4-day special session which has been scheduled, and this week only it is going to happen. Now, state appointed a panel comprising of ex-Supreme Court judges to constitute the draft UCC, submitted its final report to the Chief Minister Pushkar Singh Dhami on February 2. Report has also been passed by the state cabinet, and introduction of a UCC was a key poll promise of the BJP in the run-up to the 2022 state elections in Uttarakhand. If it gets passed, which it is likely to get passed in the assembly, because there is this 4-day special session for this, it will be the second state in India after Goa to have a uniform civil code. And if I talk about this, so a key poll promise has also been delivered by Pushkar Singh Dhami. It is like this. Now, what is a uniform civil code? We need to understand that. A uniform civil code seeks to create a uniform set of laws for which domains? The 4 personal domains: marriage, divorce, adoption, and inheritance of property. Presently, these personal domains are governed by personal laws in the country. Every religion has its own personal laws, and they are governing this, like the Hindu Marriage Act or the Muslim Marriage Act, like this. But when a uniform civil code will be there in place, all these personal laws will be replaced by that uniform civil code, and that uniform law will apply to all the religious communities in the state. And that uniform law will be with respect to these 4 aspects. Now, Article 44 of the Constitution, which is a DPSP, mentions about this, that there should be a uniform civil code. The state shall endeavour to secure for its citizens a uniform civil code throughout the territory of India. The provision is part of the directive principles. And now, when we were there in the Constituent Assembly forming and debating on the constitution to be adopted, there were some factions which were supporting that this uniform civil code should be there in the fundamental rights segment, that is part 3. Now, if it was a fundamental right, then it would be an obligation on the state to implement it. But it was not kept in that we need to know the viewpoints of various members of the Constituent Assembly on this Uniform Civil Code. It was a matter of intense debate in the Constituent Assembly whether to put it under fundamental rights or DPSPs. Now, opponents of Uniform Civil Code, means opponents of those people who wanted to not keep it or who wanted to keep it under fundamental rights, basically they said that no, it would take away the rights of religious minorities and destroy the diversity of the country. So these personal laws, they give some space to the minorities to follow their culture, to follow their religious ethos. Marriages, divorce, inheritance of property can be done according to their religion. If a uniform civil code will be in place, though, all these laws will be according to that uniform law, in which their expression or their interest may be compromised, the religious minorities. Naziruddin Ahmad from Bengal said that it would come in the way of Article 19 of the draft constitution. Actually, Article 19 of the draft constitution was now or is now Article 25. Okay. So, it is like this. Article 25, which guarantees the fundamental right to freedom of religion subject to reasonable restrictions such as public order, morality and health. Now, we can understand this, that Naziruddin Ahmad said that it would be a violation of Article 25 because if we introduce Uniform Civil Code, we will not give freedom of religion to the people. They cannot, propagate their own religion or profess or practice their own religion because these personal aspects of life, they were governed by religion. And if we bring a Uniform Civil Code, so these personal aspects will be sidelined and be suppressed under that Uniform Code. Now, Mr. K.M. Munshi, he contended that a UCC would not defeat the principle of freedom of religion, since the state is empowered to make laws related to religious practices if they were intended for social reforms. And it is believed that a major social reform which would have been there was gender equality with the introduction of Uniform Civil Code. He highlighted that various benefits such as promoting equality for women, since personal laws often prevent the elimination of discriminatory practices against women, like triple talaq and all were there which were discriminatory against women in Muslims. So K.M. Munshi said that it will lead to equality and particularly for women, and it will lead to social reforms. Now, the chief architect of the constitution, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, what he said about Uniform Civil Code, he took a more nuanced, I would say, stand on that. He said that although a UCC was desirable, it should remain purely voluntary during the initial stages. He stated that since the provision was merely recommendatory, it should not be imposed upon all citizens. What he wanted to say was, keep it in DPSPs since they are voluntary in nature. The matter was settled by a 5-4 majority vote, with the subcommittee on fundamental rights headed by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel deciding that establishing a UCC would not fall within the fundamental rights, and that is why we see it as part of the DPSPs. Article 44 it is. Now, what does the draft UCC of Uttarakhand state? Why we are calling it a draft? Because as of now it is not passed. So it is till now a draft only. Draft UCC is set to focus on gender equality by introducing provisions that treat men and women equally, especially in matters pertaining to inheritance of property. It will also revoke practices governing marriage and divorce such as polygamy or iddat. Iddat is basically mandatory period of waiting to be observed by women following dissolution of a Muslim marriage. And triple talaq, all these will be finished. The code is also likely to extend an equal property share to Muslim women against existing 25% share accorded under Muslim personal law. 50% share will be there, which will be given to the Muslim women. Minimum age for marriage for men and women is set to remain the same, that is 18 years for women, 21 years for males. Then other issues such as divorce, marriage registrations, adoption and social security for aging parents will also be covered under this particular law, and there will be mandatory registrations for live-in relationships. These are the major highlights of the Uttarakhand's Uniform Civil Code, which is likely to be tabled, I would say, in this 4-day assembly session, which is going to start, I think, today. And let's see what happens over there. The Chief Minister of Uttarakhand, Mr. Pushkar Singh Dhami, says that it is not targeting any particular religion. Rather, it is for accommodating the benefits to all the religions existing in the state. There will be this uniformity, and women empowerment for sure will be there. So let's see whether Pushkar Singh Dhami can deliver on his poll promise made in 2022 or not. And the way he delivers will definitely be watchful. If done, Uttarakhand will become the second state after Goa to have a uniform civil code. And keep a watch on this, keep following the developments over here. And with this, today's session is over, and I will be meeting you tomorrow now with more such informative news pieces. Till then, you guys keep studying, keep reading, keep writing, and most importantly, keep revising. Namaste. Jai Hind.